Hi everyone, welcome to this rather strange presentation. Um, I'm afraid I'm probably going to be eating an ice cream right now, or swimming, or probably both. But in return for signing my study leave form, Mr. Campbell suggested that I should do a brief presentation on what I did in Nepal. So here it is. Firstly, how did I manage to go to Nepal? Well, I basically replied to an email from the BOMS from the organizer for this trip, Mr. McClellan, who suggested that if I gave good reasons for why I should be able to go, then I would be able to go. And probably because there was no other applicants, I was picked as the trainee for the group. The funding was through the Norman Roe International Education Foundation, which was set up in response to the devastating earthquake that affected Nepal back in 2015. So this is what I thought I'd be doing on my trip, but I had spent a few weeks in Nepal previously hiking and kayaking, but this trip was true to its description, and I ended up having to do quite a bit of study, both in advance of going and whilst I was there too. So, if I start firstly just by comparing Nepal to the UK, that's the flag next to the Union Jack. So, the flag for Nepal is the only flag in modern times for a country which is not rectangular. The shapes in the flag are basically a stylized sun and moon. The population of Nepal is about 29 million people, and in a country that's about half the size of the UK. The graph here shows the GDP with the scale on the y-axis in millions of US dollars. The blue line is the income for the UK, and the red line, which is pretty much on the x-axis, is Nepal. Nepal is ranked 145 out of 187 countries on the UN Human Development Index, and the World Bank notes that over 70% of Nepalis live on less than $2.50 a day, and 90% on less than $4 a day. Obviously, Nepal is landlocked between China in the north and India in the south, east, and west. It's also split topographically with the Himalaya to the north, the hills in the center, and the flat jungle in the south. Until the 1950s, there were no roads connecting India or China to Nepal, and the natural defenses of the mountains and the malaria-infested jungles meant that Nepal didn't really come under colonial rule as India did. I was based for the majority of time in the bottom right-hand corner in a town called Dharan, which you can see. It's obviously far away from the mountains, but not too far from the foothills. So Nepal spends approximately $36 per person annually on healthcare. That's about $20 less than the South Asian average, and about $5 more than other developing countries globally. You can see Nepal there in the sort of greenish colour third from the bottom. And trauma in Nepal is really increasing, and the mortality rate is basically doubled between 2002 and 2012 to about 8 per 100,000 people. In the UK, that's about 2.5 per 100,000 people. Certainly the bus rides that I took in Nepal were, they made me happier than usual to have arrived at my destination. There were some quite strange rules of the road, and the buses pretty much always seemed to be overtaking with no real care for who might be coming the other way. Cars that were coming the other way had to pretty much get out of the way, really. It was quite scary. And so, unsurprisingly, there's been an increase in the road traffic accidents in Nepal as more people take to the roads, and generally, there's poor infrastructure in the roads and it's struggling to cope. There is some laxity in the law as well about whether pillion drivers on motorcycles are supposed to wear helmets. Certainly, the rules a little while ago, anyway, were that helmets with visors were not allowed to be worn, and that's basically because of an anti terrorism drive. Um, if the driver has a helmet with a visor, it should not be worn because it's actually more important to be able to see the face. This means that there's quite a lot of maxillofacial trauma in Nepal. So, armed with this knowledge and my knowledge of what you're supposed to do as an SD4, I went off to Nepal and arrived in Kathmandu. A couple of weeks before leaving, I'd been advised that I was supposed to teach on a major trauma skills workshop, attend a couple of clinics, do a bit of operating, and also attend and present at a conference in Kathmandu. So the other faculty members were Mr. Laverick from Dundee, who's wearing the pink shirt, Mr. McClellan, who works on the south coast somewhere. He's the one taking the selfie on the top left of the picture. Mr. Austin Smith, who is based in Sheffield, who's wearing the surgical kit. John Rowson, who's in the middle on the top left, but also down at the bottom, being overtaken by a man carrying a fridge on his head. And finally, Mr. Sunil Shah, who's a new consultant surgeon from Leeds. He's Nepali in origin and did his maxillofacial training in the UK. So once we arrived to Kathmandu via New Delhi, in order to help us recover from all our travelling, we'd been booked into a beautiful 5-star hotel called the Yak and Yeti. This was my first 5-star experience, and I wasn't really expecting that it would be part of a charitably funded work trip, to be honest. The Yak and Yeti is a hotel with quite a lot of history behind it, and it's in a nice part of Kathmandu, close to town. So, in the mornings I'd be able to take a jog down into this downtown area and go and do a little bit of sightseeing before breakfast. Once we'd arrived, we'd actually also been booked onto a massage, which I thought was frankly a little bit ridiculous, but it was to help us relax after our tiring journey. For me, there were some real saving graces, though, and particularly the beautiful jacaranda trees in the hotel gardens were in bloom. Obviously, the dinners were nice too. The next morning, we took a flight to Dharan. The flight passes along the face of the Himalayas, but unfortunately, there was quite a lot of cloud. We didn't get to see any of the mountains. Dharan itself is a beautiful little town, and it has an open border with India, and so there's quite a lot of Indians there too. It's got this clock tower, and it's has quite a nice ordered road system, certainly compared to the rest of Nepal. The main reason, I think, is that there's a British Gurkha base there, and the Gurkhas have a relatively high income compared to the rest of the Nepalese, which meant that all the houses were all very pretty, very well decorated, and the population themselves pay for the upkeep of the roads and so on. But the main reason we were in Nepal was because it's where the BP Koraila Institute of Health Sciences is based. That's the BPKIHS. This hospital is a really well-designed space with lots of tree-lined avenues and playing fields, and there's obviously the hills in the distance. I've checked already, there is mountain biking available in the hills. It's a 700-bedded teaching hospital, and the majority of the staff live on site, so there's a really relaxed vibe to the place. I'd often wake up at 5:30 in the morning to the sound of people playing basketball and football. In the evenings after work, people would be playing cricket and jogging. It was all really very pleasant. All the trees and the sounds of the insects in the evenings, it was a wonderful constant accompaniment, really. Apart from all that, though, BPKIHS has quite close ties to the wider medical world, with WHO workers and international students and other doctors just attending for extra experience like I did, as well as completing research projects and so on. Our local contact was somebody who Chris will probably know. He's called Mehul Jesani, who at the age of 31 is the clinical lead and head of service in the maxillofacial department at BPKIHS. Mehul spent about 9 months in Dundee, basically doing like a clinical fellow job, and he seemed like a really nice chap. So back to work then. In the clinic on the first day, we saw a good variety of patients. You might want to look away now, Mr. Campbell, but this guy obviously has a cant which has been tested for with a tried and tested method of sticking a ruler in the mouth. You can see on his CT scan that he's got something wrong with his joint, and he certainly denied a history of trauma, but said that he's had slowly increasing trismus. He was offered a biopsy in the first instance prior to any further procedures, but he decided against that treatment. This lady, she's obviously got some asymmetry there, and that's been worsening over time. Her scan, you can see that her TM joint on the right side doesn't really exist anymore. Interestingly for her, she had a long bone infection. Her leg had been infected since about the age of 12 after some trauma. It never really healed, and she walked with a limp, and she actually had a still discharging sinus present. We decided in the end that this was probably the cause of the likely hematogenous spread to the condyle, which had progressively resorbed. Obviously, her treatment would have been quite involving and needed quite a lot of planning, so nothing was offered at the time. This chap presented with a 4-month history of an enlarging lesion, which to me looks a bit older than 4 months. It looks unicystic and might be an ameloblastoma, but he hadn't undergone a biopsy by the time we saw him, unfortunately. Obviously we were there for a limited time, and so again he wasn't really ready for an operation. The day that I did spend in theatre though was this chap who was a passenger on a motorcycle and had suffered some panfacial trauma. In terms of the operating setup and that side of things, essentially things were pretty similar to what we have, apart from some small differences. There weren't really any family visiting hours, because really the family were there all the time as the healthcare assistants and the porters and the nurses and so on and so forth. They were really responsible for looking after their family members and feeding them and so on, and they would just sleep underneath the bed or just kind of propped up along the side. They did have a separate fee-paying part of the hospital where they had healthcare assistants and more staff. I was also pretty happy to see that you can wear flip-flops in theatre. That made me quite glad. The other reason really for being in Dharan was to spend 2 days teaching and then a day assessing a mix of staff comprising of qualified doctors and dentists, teaching them major trauma skills, kind of like a cut price ATLS workshop. I found this really good fun, and I took a couple of topics on. It was quite a lot of work, really, and it made me quite busy, but I got quite a lot of good feedback, and I really enjoyed it, to be honest. I found the assessment in itself pretty tiring, and any time that I wasn't coordinating or presenting, I was supposed to be in clinical theatre, so I was running around quite a bit for those 3 days. The next 3 days we headed back to Nepal, to Kathmandu, sorry. Unfortunately, I had to suffer 3 more nights in the Yak and Yeti Hotel with its delicious buffet breakfast and sauna and crisp linen. In return, though, I did have to listen to some pretty terrible talks at the joint Indian and Nepali maxillofacial surgeons conference, and I gave a terrible talk back. What sort of stuff did I learn then? Well, this is really the last slide, and I am really very grateful to the BAOMS and the Norman Rowe International Educational Foundation for sponsoring me to go all the way to Nepal and back. I feel like I learned quite a lot about the Nepalese medical system, and I feel encouraged to visit again, maybe in the future for a fellowship or something. The Major Trauma Skills Workshop was a really good learning experience, and I feel like the group as the learners really gained from it in general. Certainly the moulage scenarios were really very well attended. I saw that there was some major differences in the learning style, though, and the way that I like to teach was not necessarily the way that they like to learn. They preferred that things were a bit more didactic. They were, the students were all really very keen to address everyone as sir, and so I had people who were orthopedic consultants calling me sir, and I found the whole thing really quite farcical, really. As for the clinics, I felt that if there had been a little bit better communication, using emails or something like that, there would have been appropriate investigation of patients so that they'd been worked up prior to our arrival. In the end, out of all the patients we saw, there was only one patient who we ended up operating on, so in general I felt that communication could have been better. I also felt that there wasn't really a need for skilled surgeons, and obviously I'm not a skilled surgeon, but someone like me to be present in Nepal at all. In fact, there were quite a good number of very capable medical staff, and a lot of staff who'd spent time in the UK or in the States or Australia getting a little bit of their fellowship. I certainly noticed there was a big gap between how Mehul, who worked in Dundee, operated compared to the other local maxillofacial surgeons and trainees. And perhaps Norman Rowe International Education Foundation would be better served sponsoring people like Mehul to come to the UK instead of people like me to go to Nepal. Having said that, though, the reason why Mehul was the clinical lead at the age of 31 was because as soon as anyone got any decent experience, they disappeared off into the private sector. Certainly that was Mehul's plan anyway. Finally, I felt a little bit uncomfortable living in luxury funded by charity. Anyway, and the last few days we spent at the Midcoms conference in Kathmandu, which I thought was a little bit of a waste of time, to be honest. I found the talks were pretty much just the Indian and Nepalese surgeons showing off what they were doing and not really open to any new ways of doing things. The standard of presentations was pretty poor in general. So while I didn't get to see much of Nepal this time, I feel like the experience was definitely worthwhile. And I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, everyone. I'll be in the pool if you have any questions.